it's time for the big form modeling stage. And maybe it's familiar from the previous demos, but we want to establish the sort of three-dimensional form of the skull at this point. And the head is generally simplified when we work on the figure. We can simplify it into a a sphere or an egg shape, which is maybe a little bit more accurate. In this case, I took a little reference photo of a golf ball, so I can sort of show a similar lighting situation for you guys, which is that the light is coming from basically somewhere on the right and slightly up, but maybe it's more actually from the right than up. So maybe if I have to demonstrate the angle, it's something like this as opposed to like this. And we'll model the form accordingly with that. Something to note with the golf ball is you can actually also see the concept that the texture, the dimples on the ball are more visible where the light is sort of raking or very parallel to the texture. Something you can see over here where the it sort of turns away from the light. Right at the dark halftones, it starts turning into the very texturous stuff that you see over there. And this is applicable to basically any surface with some texture on it. So basically the darkest areas of the halftone generally show the most texture. That's just a side note for this this segment of the process. And generally we want to basically move on from this stage with the big form modeling, but as I see it, there's quite a few places where we could use some drawing corrections before we move along. I think the process should serve the user, to make it more simple and make the whole experience better, as opposed to be rigid for the sake of rigidity. So the next stage would be variations of the darks, where we would fix the drawing. But as I see it, I think we would be better off if we fix some of the articulation of the shadows at this point, because then we won't have to actually fix the modeling at the same time as well. So yeah, this area in particular is very unrefined right now. Partly it's because we have maybe less contrast here than on the reference image, and that might be because we lightened this area of the background a little bit. But by slightly lightening this shadow over here, we can pull a little bit more of the skulls drawing out. And we can go back in the articulation of the shadows basically during the variations of the dark stages and fix some of this stuff. Just want to push this shadow a little bit to the left. I don't think it goes that far. We'll be applying tone there anyways next. Also, maybe at this point we want to check if there's a lot of like remnant dust left on the light areas on the skull, so we can just pick those up right now. Try to use a clean bit of the eraser so you don't actually introduce more dust as opposed to taking it away from there. It's very subtle, but I definitely see a change in the tone, so I'm just gonna clean the lights a little bit as well. So at this point, let's clean up the lights a little and then fix some of these small errors in the shadow shapes before we start doing the big form modeling. We have to anyways fix some of the things after the big form modeling stage, but I think it's better to start with a more accurate than less accurate statement. That way we will have less things to fix afterwards. I think this shadow is still a little bit too wide, so let's just narrow it down a little bit. As you can see, it remains kind of messy on that side where we've had a lot of tone in. So that's why we want to be fairly strict with the drawing before we start toning things in. But this is the dark halftone area, so we don't really mind having tone on there. If it was right around here where we would have to fix things, then this light area might be smudged. And we don't like that. All right, well, I think we can just move along right now. I don't see any like major things I need to fix before moving to the big form modeling stage. At this point we can use I generally like to use this bristle side of the brush. It leaves a little bit softer of a mark than the sponge side. But if we need to get darker in places, then we want to use the sponge side. So let's just check if this is a dark enough tone for us to use on the dark halftone areas. One thing that is sometimes happening in cases like this is that you don't really want to go directly into the shadow and start scrubbing it in, because then you lose all semblance of a drawing that you've sort of worked hard to achieve for this stage. And as a result, you don't really go near enough to the shadow with this tool, and you're left with something that is like a light streak over there, and it might distract you from the form. It sort of destroys the illusion very, very subtly, where the dark halftone is met with a lighter line and then the shadow starts. That sort of, it's hard to sort of pick up if you don't know what you're looking at, but when you know it's there, then it's easy to pick up and then fix with a charcoal stick actually. But yeah, we established that we have enough tone on this bristle side, so maybe we don't really have to go into the sponge side really. So right now we just want to find the overall egg shape for the skull. And this stage will appear a little bit messy at the start, and you need to sort of practice it a little bit to get a feel for the three-dimensional form. It's normal that you don't get this thing right at the first. That's completely fine. Don't worry about it. You'll get it with practice. And you can just pull up a reference egg or something, you know, just take a photo of an egg or use the photo of a golf ball, which I didn't have eggs, for this stage as your reference. And you can basically just be looking at that while you're doing this stage. One thing that is most common, I think, in this stage of the big form modeling is that the dark halftones are left too light. And that tends to result in a flat sort of feeling, where it sort of creates the sense that there is an angle break happening as opposed to a form that is turning. Where if your tones are light, it feels like the plane is turning like this, and then the shadow starts. Whereas if you make them dark, it sort of turns naturally into the shadows. This is kind of conceptual, I understand, and it's a bit tricky to sort of grasp at the first. I didn't grasp it at first when I was a student, and that's fine. Now to go over some of the principles while we're working at this stage. Again, I'm applying some charcoal dust from the jar I have over there, and then I'm tapping the brush so there's, you know, a nice amount but no like loose charcoal dust, so it's more controllable. To go over some principles, basically this whole process requires a bit of knowledge about how light on form works. And it's not even from the light onwards towards the shadow. The darkest tones are always next to the shadow, that's obvious, but they don't carry out, you know, halfway. That, let's say if we have a value scale, the middle point of the value scale doesn't end up around the middle of the form. It ends up very close to the edge of the shadow. So the majority of the light shape is actually very light, and the turning tones, the sort of value scale of the middle tones is compressed very near the shadow edge. And this is because the light fall off is sort of exponential towards the shadow. And there's a very good explanation of this. I think it's a Proco channel video with Dorian Eaton, and I've added to the playlist this video, so you can actually watch that. It's for this three-dimensional shading, and there's a demonstration of actually an egg being rendered in that video. So I think that might be very helpful for you to sort of understand how this form logic works. And we want to apply the charcoal as smooth as we can. That's why we use the brush, not hatching. And the hatching sort of, it is a stylistic choice definitely if we want to go into that, like lean on the hatching. But it does sort of remain a bit more visible at the end. Maybe cleaning up, rendering like this does take a bit of effort with the dot picking. You know, we have to go in and clean up this darker stuff over here, area by area, and then we end up with something that is nice and refined. With hatching, you may not have to do that because you don't end up with darker things in the wrong places because you have way more control. But it takes a lot longer to achieve the three-dimensional form, I think. And some of my schoolmates actually took really nice care during this stage, and it was like super fine at the end. Like there was no gradations. I mean, sorry, the gradation was perfect. There was like no smudginess to the application at the end, so they probably had it pretty nice at the rendering stage. They didn't have to like smooth things out anymore because it was very smooth already. So you can really like apply very softly and slowly, gradually at this stage, and you will end up with something that is quite smooth actually. That portion may have gone a little bit too dark over here. Here's where the stump comes in. As I was saying, this thing can actually erase a bit because I feel like it picks up more than it leaves dust on the surface usually. But again, we want to make things dark enough, and we want to make them dark enough close to the edge of the shadow where possible. We might end up with these lighter worms like over here. It's not really reading as a form that well, but we'll go over all the shadow edges in the next stage of the variations when we fix the articulation of the shadow shapes and the drawing itself in general, and start finding the smaller shadows and all that stuff once we have this sort of base form established. So for me personally, I think it was like pretty much half a year into my academic training where I was working on probably my first charcoal figure, where the big form modeling actually clicked for me, and where I finally sort of felt like now I understand what we're supposed to do, you know, and how it's supposed to feel when the form turns. I remember I was probably modeling like the model's leg or something, where it was like a very cylindrical form, and it's sort of, now it's turning. Before that it was like, I'm not sure, but I'll just go through this stage, you know, multiple times, and then finally it starts, you know, making sense. This portion is in the light, and it's a bit of a different form because it sort of goes inwards like that, but it's in the dark area of the form overall, so I want to tone that in a little bit. It's not as light as it seems. So perhaps you can already see like I'm moving from very dark to a quite light tone here already, and I'm just gradually pushing it towards the crest of light over here. The crest of light is a term we used for, you know, the lightest area of the form basically. So basically this area appears quite light on the drawing. I know some of you might be wondering about that. This is basically an exception plane over here in the dark area of the form, and basically thinking that this is sort of turning towards that side. So we'll leave it at that. We just make the overall form work, and then at the end, during the plane stage, at the very last stage of the exceptions, we'll be looking at that, you know, see if it's light enough when we darken the planes next to it and all that stuff. And then we just lighten it ever so slightly to make it read as the separate lighter plane over there. But we don't want to lighten it too much, you know, we're definitely not leaving this paper white over here. That will destroy the form. We're trying to create an illusion here. And there's probably multiple separate ones as well. We could discuss like, well, many of the planes on these teeth, for example. And I think this is where the sort of knowledge you've picked up with the value scale and sort of honed your eye with the rendering of the graphite pieces comes in. Because when you're doing this kind of modeling, you really need to see very subtle things happening on the form. Well, in the tones, let's say, because you need to gradate things very softly from one side of the form to the next. And it's pretty hard to do if you don't really have any practice seeing these subtleties. You may have heard of a thing called over-modeling, and it's something I've heard used in, you know, two different contexts in my opinion. One is where you sort of make dirty lights, which means that you sort of push the halftones, you know, we might have this tone appearing in the middle of the skull over here, and it appears like, yeah, there's a lot of tones on the skull, and you're, in theory, you know, applying a nice gradation, but it doesn't feel like three-dimensional because that's not how light works. So that's like the dirty lights version of the over-modeling. And the other thing is where, you know, maybe something isn't quite a sphere, but more of a dome shape, but you model it in sort of to be a sphere. So you sort of turn the form too much for what you're seeing actually. And I think that's different from idealization, which is what we're doing here. We're just sort of thinking what kind of primary form this skull would represent, and that would be an egg shape or a sphere of some kind. But yeah, you sometimes see that where people sort of know these principles, but then they, you know, make everything appear like a sphere or make everything appear like a cylinder, even though, you know, there's more nuance to it than that. So there's two different things. There's a sort of poor rendition of form, which is the dirty lights variant, and then there's the sort of application kind of thing where you apply it maybe too liberally to everything, once you learn it. And I've heard both of these being referred to as over-modeling, so maybe that clarifies it if you've heard the term. This is a stage where you really need to squint and see how it's appearing. As we've established, we're trying to establish an illusion here. If it doesn't look like it's turning, then you need to do something about it. All the later stages are basically just kind of like normal drawing, if one were to use a term like that. But this is the sort of last base layer, I want to say, for a project like this. We're sort of setting ourselves up for a very easy success on the later stages. We've got form, we've got accurate drawing, you know, all that good stuff. It's pretty much smooth sailing from here on out if we do these steps nicely. It's a lot of work though to render something like this, but it's actually fun when you don't have to, you know, correct things all the time and get frustrated. You could also break this skull into, you know, smaller forms as well if you wish to, and you know how to do it. Just keep in mind the overall sort of structure, which is the egg shape, should always be underlying. We could sort of turn this muzzle shape as a sort of separate cylinder over here. And, you know, this mandible area over here is a little bit more, you know, flat, as it kind of comes in from here and then turns at an angle. Stuff like this. So we don't need to like overly idealize everything basically here, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm just trying to mainly communicate that sphere idea over here. This is a very light plane, but that's also an exception. It's right next to the shadows over here. And overall, if we sort of split up the image where this is the dark area of the image, this is the light area of the image, we can definitely see that the nose, well, nasal bone sort of sits on that darker area of the image. We can't have that being like paper white, even though it's one of the lightest things we actually see on the image. So we'll treat it as an exception. We'll probably, you know, might leave it at something like this, but everything around it tends to go darker. Also here we're obviously seeing a lot of like darker planes, but we don't put those in right now. Here I'm basically just thinking like, do we need to put in some more information at this stage, or do we leave it like this? But it's not done yet for sure. So yeah, I think we need to darken the darker stuff over here. It's not really turning. I'll just take a step back and look at it from slightly further away. Yeah, it's moving to the right direction for sure. I think before calling this stage quits, we want to definitely have a break and see how it feels after that break. So don't rush forward. But I guess at this stage, you know, you want to start really being critical about it, you know, what do we need to add? Because here we're sort of always in the risk of starting to create those dirty lights I was speaking about. Here I'm almost just using the sort of remnant charcoal in the brush to create those very, very, very soft light halftones. Maybe one thing we can start doing over here is sort of establishing the turning over on the light areas as well. So there's definitely some of that. We're sort of ignoring the textures bits over here. What we have is the sort of shadow shape mapped over here. But we can see there's sort of a plane that is intermediate between the lighter area and the shadow there. So we can just sort of simplify that into a darker turning and apply the texture on top there. The shadow shape doesn't really need to be super precise, so I'm kind of feeling free to just soften it at this point already. Whatever sharpness is happening over there we can apply later when we're doing the texture stuff anyway. Perhaps the same could happen over here as well, where I can just somewhat blend the edges, because this was one of the areas where it's not really fully in shadow, it's not fully in light, so just simplified it as that. We just want to have a general tone, I guess, to work with the form over there. Yeah, over on this lighter side of things, we don't want to see, you know, everything end to a sort of paper white at the edge. That also creates a sense of flatness. I think this side of things is more or less looking pretty fine. You know, it's something we can definitely work off of, adding stuff on top and, you know, refining from here. So I think we've established some kind of, you know, form already. But this side definitely needs a bit of work. We're definitely not going as dark because also, as we stated, it's mostly coming from the right side, the light, not from, you know, our point of view. When, you know, it's not front lit, it's rather more side lit, but it's, you know, something like a 30-degree angle if I have to, you know, guess at something. The shadows are kind of pushed to the side over here. But yeah, that means that the lightest area is something like, you know, very, very close to the right side for sure, but we definitely should see some turning over on the edges as well. So we don't want to leave these things flat. And we don't really mind if we smudge a little bit of the edge of the skull over there with the background. We can always come back and then adjust those. There's a saying that it's always easier to make something sharper than softer. And that stands true in here. You know, we don't mind if everything is a little bit soft over here as long as there's some kind of, you know, drawing happening still. We don't want to turn it into a cotton ball either, but you know, it's a couple of strokes with the sharp charcoal stick and it's looking like it's sharp again. For softness, we have to, you know, go back and forth or dot pick a lot, so it's definitely not as simple. So we maybe want to err on the softer side of things. So this skull is sort of turning from downwards to the top, as well as from the side towards the crest of light, as well as from the top. So we can see, you know, where we want to put this sort of modeling. We don't want to, again, over model, but push the darks too far. And what the tone we want to use on this side is definitely, for the darkest stuff, is definitely a lot lighter than the darkest stuff over here. Like we have nothing like this over here. These tones should be maybe around what we have here. You know, we don't have dark turning tones over on this side because we're not next to shadow. We're quite near the lights actually here. If you find yourself leaving darker marks with the stump when you're trying to lighten things, you could just wipe off the tip of the stump a little bit on your kneaded eraser. If it's not working, then it's not working, and then you just have to pick out the darker stuff. Here I had a little bit too much charcoal in the brush, I think, and ended up with something a little darker than I would have hoped. Then we can just re-soften things a little bit here. It's better. And again, here we don't want to have the lightest thing on the edge. If you see some light lines on the edge, then that means that you need to either soften it like this or apply some charcoal directly, because it won't appear like a form until that light line is lost. So we can actually do something like this over here. Just slightly working the charcoal. Maybe we can then reapply the brush a little bit, see if it sort of makes it disappear in there. And it's a little better, but this portion here is a little too dark. I think that's kind of the culprit, actually, creating the lighter streak towards the edge. Maybe the edge tone is fine, but that's also part of assessing the drawing, is, you know, knowing when to lighten things and knowing when to darken things. So if you get a streak of light next to the dark background over there, you need to ask a question, you know, do I need to darken the streak or do I need to lighten the tone next to it in order to achieve what I want? Maybe I'm getting a bit noodly over here, but I just want to make it a point that we really want to make the form turn at this stage. We'll be rendering all these areas anyway, so we want to make them nice at the end. But yeah, for now, let's leave it like that. This needs a little bit more turning over here. It's just a little hard to do with the not so sharp charcoal stick. So what I'm doing, I'm basically applying just a little bit of charcoal here and then sort of spreading it around a little bit with the brush. This is something you can do as well. Might end up with a smooth finish. This is a personal way of working, I suppose. So you can always see what works best for you. I don't think many people work in a strictly similar, well, in the strictly same way with these tools in school anyways. I think with pencils there's a lot fewer ways you can do it, you know, freely and expressing your own personal feels, but already in this charcoal stage we're starting to see individuality with how you work your tools. And that's something that'll eventually also, I think, be part of your sort of handwriting as an artist. Maybe I feel like this sort of forehead area is not turning as much as it needs to yet, so let's just push it a little bit more. Also at this point, maybe you'll start seeing some inconsistencies overall in the patchiness of the application or stuff like that, and you can always just remedy those things in the upcoming stages, or you can just go in and fix them right now. It's up to you. If it bothers you, then I would recommend just fix it right away. Also sort of eliminates the possibility that you just forget about it. I think a good rule of thumb is don't, you know, postpone fixing something if you can just take care of it right now. That way you don't end up with a massive list of things to fix. That can be a bit discouraging. And also if it's just a mental list, then you might forget a lot of that stuff. So better to take care of it once you notice it. This is a general rule. If you're working on rendering an area, then maybe just focus on that area. Don't jump around too much. Even if you notice things, make notes of those for yourself in the future, but you'll come back to those areas anyways. Okay, I think that might be it for this big four modeling stage, but we'll see. I'll have a break and then I'll return to this drawing and see if I still want to adjust some things.